Next, we're going to look at a very versatile concept in the system, which is if you need to bill for multiple practices from one database or need to use multiple billing NPIs or tax IDs, how you can do that from the system in the one database. To keep in mind, if you're doing the billing from the one database for multiple practices or tax IDs, the patients will of course be shared within the database. So there's no way to restrict the patients within the database, but if you do have patients that come into the same practice and you need to bill out of it using multiple billing NPIs, which is box 33 NPIs, let's take a look at how you can do that. So we'll go under the setup and click on practice. The practice/legal entity screen is where you can set up those different billing information. So you can see that I already have two setups that are in here. One is for Medical Care and Wellness Inc., which has got a set of tax ID and NPI. Another setup here, which is another legal entity setup, which has got a different group NPI and tax ID. Now, the system will always have a primary legal entity. So the primary legal entity, as you can see here, which is marked with the red text at primary, generally when claims are or billing is done, the system would always use the primary legal entity's billing information, like the billing NPI on the primary legal entity or the tax ID on that primary legal entity is what the system would always use for the claims. You can also have secondary legal entities set up and have that secondary legal entity's information go out on the claims. Now, the only important thing here is when you set up a secondary legal entity, on this setup, the separate account has to always be set up as yes. This is a very important field, and this is what drives if the claims or if the billings need to use this legal entity information, you would need to set this up as yes. If you set it up as no, what it means is that the claims will always use a primary legal entity, irrespective of what legal entity has been used on the claim. Now, the legal entities are set up primarily for two purposes. One is, of course, for the billing reasons, where you need to have separate billing information. The second reason is when you need to have multiple locations show up on the scheduler. So if you need multiple locations on the scheduler, which is irrelevant to billing, you would need to set up multiple legal entities. So you may still see practices that have multiple legal entities that may get set up, but that's for a non-billing purpose. It's just for having those locations show up on the schedule. Now, when such locations get set up, or such legal entities get set up, you will notice that it is always set up as separate account no. So we have understood the concept of the legal entity. Now, once the legal entity setup is done, the next step is to link the providers to legal entities. You can have a set of providers which maybe only need to be linked to this legal entity, or you may have a set of providers that only need to be linked to the second legal entity. Or you may have providers that need to be linked to both. So the linking is done on this provider setup screen. And when you go to the provider screen, you can see that there is this legal entity field. This is how this provider maps to this legal entity. So all the legal entities that are selected here, the provider will show up on that legal entities for that legal entity. This will not only be for scheduling, but also for billing as well. Now let's look at how you would select the legal entity on the claim. So when you're going to the charge entry screen, you would have noticed on rendering provider, this is where you select the provider that needs to be used on the claim. And you will notice that the format of this provider is the provider's name followed by the legal entity name. So you can see that this provider is linked to this legal entity as well as to this legal entity. The second provider, which is James Morrison, is only linked to one legal entity. So if I use this provider, Boris Berkeley, with medical diagnostic clinic, link to that, it would use the medical diagnostic clinic billing information, whichever information is saved on that legal entity, it's going to use that information. Whereas if I use Boris Berkeley with the medical care and wellness clinic, it'll use that medical care and wellness clinic and billing information. So when we talk about billing information, what this typically means is that, or to be specific, what it means is that when we select this provider with this legal entity combination, it is going to have that legal entity name as the billing provider name, as well as the legal entity's physical address and the pay to address that is set up in that legal entity. It's going to use that information for the box 33 physical address as well as the pay to address. And in addition, it also uses the billing NPI that is set up there and the tax ID that is set up there to populate on the 25 in the tax ID field and in the 33A for the NPI. So that's a very important or a very versatile application of the legal entity, which you could use for billing or billing multiple information out of the system.